Silas Vance didn't knock. He never knocked. The door to the Clearwater Bank swung open under his boot heel like it owed him something, and every head in the room turned. Tellers, clerks, the nervous young deputy who'd been foolish enough to be standing near the window. Silas walked straight to the front counter, set both palms flat on the wood, and smiled the way a man smiles when he's already won. "Hayes Ranch," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I want the lien papers filed by noon tomorrow. Every acre, every fence post, every nail and every rotting board." The teller's mouth opened. "But Mr. Vance, the legal window doesn't close until sunset. Then make sunset come early." He straightened his coat, turned toward the door, and added without looking back, "And if Colton Hayes shows his face anywhere near my office, remind him that dead men don't have property rights." The room went silent. Outside, the Wyoming sun hammered the dirt street like it was trying to break something. If you've ever watched someone lose everything they loved because one ruthless man decided he wanted it, stay right here. This story is going to take you somewhere you won't forget. Like this video, drop your city and country in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. And subscribe to the channel so you never miss what comes next. Because trust me, what happens between that cowboy and the school teacher he asked to be his wife for one night, it will stay with you long after the credits roll. Now, let's go back to where it really began. The stagecoach had been running 40 minutes behind schedule since Rawlins, which was the first sign that the day intended to go badly. Lydia Rowan sat wedged between a large traveling merchant who smelled of tobacco and a widow in black crepe who hadn't spoken a word since they crossed the county line. The bench was hard. The road was worse. Every rut the wheels dropped into sent a jolt straight up Lydia's spine, and she'd stopped trying to read her book somewhere around the second hour because the words kept jumping off the page. She was 24 years old, carrying one trunk, $43, and a teaching certificate issued by the Cheyenne Board of Education. That was the sum total of her fresh start. She pressed her forehead against the window frame and watched the land open up. Great flat stretches of yellow grass giving way to distant blue ridges, the sky enormous overhead, indifferent and beautiful in equal measure. Wyoming in late August had a particular quality of light, something almost violent about the way it hit the earth, and Lydia had been trying to decide for 2 days whether she found it oppressive or freeing. She hadn't reached a verdict yet. The merchant to her left shifted, bumped her elbow, and muttered an apology without meaning it. The widow stared forward. The driver up top cracked his whip, and the horses picked up their pace as the road widened, approaching a shallow river crossing. That was the moment everything changed. The first shot came from the ridge on the left. A single crack, sharp and flat. The way gunshots always sound different in real life than in anyone's imagination. Then 3 more in rapid succession. The driver shouted something profane and desperate, and the coach lurched hard to the right as the horses panicked and veered from the road. Lydia grabbed the door handle by instinct, not out of any rational plan, but because her body needed something solid. The merchant was already on the floor, whimpering. The widow, to her unexpected credit, did not make a sound. "Get down!" Lydia didn't know who she was talking to. She said it anyway. The coach hit something, a rock, a rut, the edge of a gully, and the front left wheel gave way with a sound like a rifle shot of its own. The whole vehicle pitched sideways and went down hard, dragging the screaming horses with it, and for approximately 3 seconds, Lydia was weightless inside a spinning wooden box before the world stopped and she found herself lying against the door with the merchant's boot against her ear. Silence. Then shouting, from outside, from above, and the thunder of hooves. She pulled herself upright, every muscle protesting, and looked out the cracked window. 4 riders, faces masked with bandanas. One of them had already dismounted and was pulling at the driver, who lay motionless against the wheel. Another was walking toward the coach door with his hand on his gun and no particular hurry in his step. Lydia looked around for something. Anything. Her trunk had broken open and its contents were scattered. Books, 2 dresses, a small wooden box that held her teaching certificate and what remained of her savings. She grabbed the box, shoved it inside her coat, and was still deciding what to do next when the coach door was torn off its hinges from the outside. The outlaw who looked in at her had pale eyes and a week of beard, and looked at her the way a man looks at something he intends to take. "Out," he said. "I have nothing worth stealing," she told him. "Out," he said again, with less patience. She climbed out. The three passengers were herded against the side of the ruined coach. The driver was breathing, but not conscious. Two of the outlaws were going through the cargo hold, pulling bags out and slitting them open, and a third was keeping his rifle trained on the group with practiced boredom. The one with the pale eyes was doing the talking, going through pockets, taking watches and coins, and anything that gleamed. When he reached Lydia, she was standing straight. She'd made a decision about that. She wasn't sure when, but the decision was made, and she wasn't going to be small about it. "Where is it?" he said. "Where is what?" "Whatever you're holding, inside the coat." She said nothing. He reached for her lapel. What happened next was not planned, not practiced, not anything Lydia would have described as brave. It was simply the way her body responded to a threat, and her body apparently had opinions her mind hadn't been consulted about. She grabbed his wrist with both hands and twisted hard, stepping sideways and into him in the same motion, and the combination of his surprise and her momentum bought her approximately 2 seconds before his partner noticed. 2 seconds was exactly enough, because that was when the rider came over the ridge at a dead gallop. He wasn't riding fast the way men ride when they're chasing something. I was riding fast the way men ride when they're ending something, and there was a quality to his presence that registered before Lydia could have explained it rationally. Something about the straightness of his back and the way his hand was already moving to his holster, even while the horse was still in full stride. The outlaws saw him at the same moment. Two decisions happened simultaneously. Lydia dropped flat to the ground, which she would later attribute to instinct and would never entirely believe. And the rider drew and fired twice before his horse even stopped moving. Both shots connected. The outlaw who'd grabbed Lydia's coat was already backing away, clutching his arm. The one with the rifle had dropped it. The other two were already on their horses and moving. The rider pulled up hard, his horse dancing sideways in the dirt, and for a moment he just looked at the scene, the wrecked coach, the stunned passengers, the two injured outlaws deciding rapidly that this particular job was no longer worth its wages. Then he looked at Lydia, still on the ground, hands pressed flat in the dust. "You hurt?" he said. She sat up, took stock. "No." "You sure?" "I'm sure." She stood, brushed at her coat, discovered her hands were shaking, and was furious about it. "Thank you." He studied her for a beat longer than felt comfortable, then turned his horse and went after the outlaws who'd run. Not because he expected to catch them, Lydia would later understand, but because he needed to know which direction they'd gone. His name, she learned from the driver when the man finally regained consciousness, was Colton Hayes. The driver said it the way you'd say the name of someone the whole territory knew, with a certain weight attached, like the name itself carried information. Colton Hayes ran the Hayes Ranch out past the northern ridge. Been doing it since his father passed. Kept to himself. Had a reputation that preceded him into every town and an expression that discouraged follow-up questions. "You're lucky he was riding that road today," the driver said, holding his head. Lydia thought about the pale-eyed outlaw's hand closing on her coat, and agreed. Colton Hayes returned 20 minutes later without the outlaws, but with a reasonable sense of where they'd gone. He helped right the coach far enough to get the horses free, arranged for the driver to get assistance from a nearby ranch, and spoke less than 30 words through the entire process. The merchant, recovered from his flight instinct, kept trying to thank him and getting approximately the same expression in return, a short nod, and the clear sense that further thanks would not be welcome. The widow gave Colton Hayes a long, assessing look and then said, "You'll do," which was the most she'd said to anyone all day. He blinked at that. It might have been the closest he came to a smile. Because the stagecoach wasn't going anywhere until the wheel was repaired, and because the nearest town, Harlan Creek, was 4 miles east, Colton ended up riding alongside the small group as they made the walk in the afternoon heat. The merchant fell behind quickly. The widow maintained a pace that suggested she'd walked longer distances under worse conditions and found the whole exercise mildly beneath her. Lydia walked beside Colton's horse in silence for the first mile. It was the kind of silence that doesn't ask to be filled. "You teach?" he said eventually. Not unfriendly, just direct. She glanced up. "How did you know?" "Books. Fell out of your trunk." He paused. "I picked them up." She hadn't noticed. She thought about the image of this broad-shouldered, hard-eyed rancher crouching in the road to gather scattered textbooks, and something about it didn't quite fit the reputation the driver had implied. "I have a position in Harlan Creek," she said, "starting Monday." "It's a small school." "I know." "Last teacher left after 6 weeks." She looked up at him again. He wasn't trying to discourage her. His voice had no particular tone to it, like he was simply reporting information and she could do with it what she wanted. She found that preferable to the alternative. "The one before her stayed 3 years," Lydia said. "I read the district records." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite respect, not quite surprise, something between the two. "You read district records before taking a job." "I read everything I can find before I go somewhere new." She looked at the road ahead. "It's easier to be surprised by what's good than by what's difficult." He was quiet for a moment. "That's an unusual way to think." "My father taught me. He was a practical man." "Was." "He died 2 years ago. My mother the year before. I have no siblings." She said it plainly, without apology or performance. It was simply true, and she'd learned that the fastest way to get past the sympathy people felt obligated to perform was to present the facts without ceremony. Colton Hayes said, "I'm sorry," and meant it in the same plain way she'd spoken, without decoration. They walked in silence for another quarter mile. "The house you'll be boarding in," he said, "Margaret Ellison's place. She's particular about noise before 7 in the morning." "Do you know everyone in Harlan Creek?" "Most of them." He looked at the road the same way she did, directly, without apology. "Small territory. Word travels." They reached the edge of town as the sun began its long slide toward the ridgeline. Harlan Creek was not a glamorous place. A main street of maybe 14 buildings, a water tower, a feed store that seemed to be doing most of the town's commercial business, and a collection of houses spreading back from the road in no particular geometric order. But there was a kind of substance to it, Lydia thought. The buildings looked like they'd been built to stay. She got her bearings, found the boarding house, and turned to thank him again. A real thanks this time, for more than just the shooting. He was already turning his horse to go. "Mr. Hayes." He stopped. She didn't entirely know what she wanted to say. "The job you do, tracking outlaws." "Ranch work," he said. "That's the job. The rest is just what happens when you live out here." She nodded slowly. He rode. She watched him go for longer than she would have admitted. The boarding house was run by Margaret Ellison, who was in her 60s, suspicious of strangers, and completely won over by the fact that Lydia noticed the quilt on the parlor wall and correctly identified it as a double wedding ring pattern. Margaret showed her to a clean room with a view of the back garden and told her supper was at 6 and that there was a man named Vance who'd been buying up property across the valley and that she ought to know who to avoid. "How will I recognize him?" Lydia asked. "He'll be the one smiling," Margaret said, and left her to unpack. Colton Hayes did not sleep that night. He sat on the porch of his ranch house in the dark and looked at the land the way a man looks at something he's not sure he'll be able to keep, and thought about numbers. The numbers were not favorable. His father had taken a loan against the Northeast pastures 11 years ago. A loan from a local financier who had since sold the debt to Silas Vance, who had also since discovered a legal provision buried in the original deed that required the property owner to be married before the age of 35 in order to claim full legal title without a co-signatory. Colton Hayes was 34 years and 9 months old. He had discovered this provision 2 weeks ago through the kind of clerical accident that turns out not to be an accident at all. A letter had arrived, not from Vance directly, that wasn't his style, but from Vance's lawyer, very politely informing Colton that under the terms of the original Hayes land grant, full title would revert to the lending institution if the current owner remained unmarried at the time of his 35th birthday, which fell in approximately 11 weeks. Except that Vance's lawyer had also noted, in the same letter, equally politely, that the lending institution had initiated foreclosure proceedings on the outstanding loan, and that those proceedings would reach their legal conclusion in, and here the politeness had a particular sharpness to it, 36 hours. 36 hours. That was the number Colton kept returning to. He needed to be married before sunset tomorrow. He had, at this particular moment in his life, 0 prospects and no idea how to acquire them. He tried to think through this rationally. There were women in Harlan Creek he knew, wives of neighbors, daughters of ranchers, women he'd nodded at in the feed store for a decade. But there was no woman in Harlan Creek he could walk up to and say what needed to be said, because what needed to be said was this: I need you to marry me today. It won't be real. You'll be free to leave after the documents are filed, and I have nothing to offer you for the inconvenience except my gratitude and whatever's left of my self-respect. He couldn't do that to someone who had a life here, a reputation, people who'd see her afterward, but a woman who was new, a woman who had no ties yet to this town, who had arrived today and knew no one and owed no one anything. He pressed that thought down hard the moment it formed, because it was exactly the kind of desperate logic that led men to do things they couldn't undo. He sat on the porch for 3 more hours. By the time he walked back into the house, he hadn't made a decision, but he'd exhausted all the other options thoroughly enough that the one remaining was starting to look less like exploitation and more like a question someone had the right to answer for themselves. He told himself the distinction mattered. He was still telling himself that when he walked into Harlan Creek at 8 the following morning and found Lydia Rowan at the town's small general store, buying chalk for her classroom with the focused precision of someone who did not intend to run short. She saw him, nodded, went back to her chalk selection. He stood inside the doorway for a moment too long, which was not like him, and when she glanced up again there was a slight question in her expression. He said, I need to speak with you. Good morning to you too, she said, not unkindly. Good morning. He pulled his hat off, which was also not entirely like him. I need to ask you something. It's unusual. She set the chalk down. All right. He looked at the store owner who was pretending to reorganize a shelf and listening to every syllable. Colton looked back at Lydia. Somewhere else. They ended up on the side of the building, in the narrow strip of shade between the general store and the harness shop. It was not a romantic location. It smelled of leather and dust and recently fed horses. He said it the same way he'd told her about the school's previous teachers, directly, without softening, because he didn't think she'd appreciate softening and because he didn't know how. He told her about the deed, about the provision, about Silas Vance and the 36-hour window and what would happen to Hayes Ranch if he couldn't produce a marriage certificate by sunset. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, And you're asking me. You're new here. You don't have people who'll talk about this for the next 10 years. If you agree, we file the papers, you keep your freedom, and I find a way to compensate you for the trouble. If you don't agree, he stopped. Then I understand it completely, and I'll never mention it again. She was quiet for a moment. Be my wife, he said, just for the paperwork. One day. That's all I heard you, she said. He waited. She looked at him, not with pity, which he would have hated, and not with calculation, which he would have distrusted, but with the same direct attention she'd given everything since he'd first seen her climbing out of a ruined stagecoach. I'll need to think about it, she said. He nodded. That was fair. That was more than fair. Meet me at the courthouse at noon, she said. I'll give you an answer then. He put his hat back on. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. She went back inside and finished buying her chalk. He walked back to his horse, untied it, and stood there with his hand on the saddle horn for a moment. He wasn't sure what he'd expected. Not the calm of it. Not the fact that she'd asked for time to think instead of just saying no, which would have been the entirely reasonable response of any sensible person. His ranch hand Eli was waiting at the end of the street, having witnessed the general outline of the conversation from a sufficient distance to have formed incorrect theories about its nature. Well, Eli said. She's thinking, Colton said. Eli looked at the general store, then at Colton. Thinking about what? Colton mounted his horse. I'll explain later. He rode back toward the ranch with the strange sensation of a man who has done something irreversible and is not yet sure whether it was catastrophic or necessary. The morning was already burning off its early cool, the sky turning from pale to hard blue, and somewhere across town Silas Vance was undoubtedly drinking his morning coffee and watching his pocket watch and feeling very satisfied with how things were arranged. Colton intended to adjust his satisfaction significantly. He just needed the schoolteacher to say yes. At 11:45, he was standing outside the Harlan Creek Courthouse, a term that flattered the building somewhat, as it was in fact a single room added onto the back of the sheriff's office, when his ranch hand Eli came riding hard from the north road with an expression that meant the day was about to get considerably worse. Fire! Eli said, pulling up hard. North Barn. And Colton. He caught his breath. There's men, a lot of them. They're not trying to put it out. The world seemed to go very still for approximately 1 second. Then Colton Hayes moved. I was already moving before Eli finished the sentence. There was no moment of hesitation, no standing still to process the information. Colton's boot hit the stirrup, and he was up and turning his horse north before the word men had fully cleared Eli's mouth. The horse knew. Animals always knew when the intention behind the hands on the reins was serious, and this horse had been ridden by this man in serious situations before. It didn't waste time. Eli fell in beside him, and they rode hard up the north road without speaking, because there was nothing to say that the situation hadn't already said. Colton didn't let himself think about the courthouse. About 11:45. About the schoolteacher standing outside a building waiting for a man who wasn't going to show up. He thought about the North Barn instead, and about how many of his hands were likely inside it at this hour, and about what a lot of them meant in practical terms when it came to the number of armed men surrounding his property. The smoke was visible from half a mile out, a dark column rising straight in the still air, the kind of thick, rolling smoke that comes from old dry wood catching fast. His chest did something complicated when he saw it. That barn had been built by his grandfather. He'd played in the loft as a boy. His father had proposed to his mother in the shadow of that building on a summer evening, or so the story went. He didn't let himself feel any of that yet. The ranch came into view around the bend in the road, and what he saw made him pull up short for just a moment, not from fear, but from the need to count and assess before he rode into something blind. There were 17 men that he could see, possibly more behind the outbuildings. They weren't wearing masks. This wasn't a robbery, and they weren't pretending otherwise. They were positioned with a deliberateness that spoke of instructions received in advance, spread out along the fence line, and the approach to the main house in a configuration that was designed not to attack but to contain. To make a point. To say, "We are here, we are many, and you are one man on a horse." The North Barn was fully involved. Nothing was going to save it. 3 of his ranch hands were huddled near the water trough. Denny, who was 17 and had only been working the ranch 6 months, and 2 older men named Paris and Webb, who Colton had known for years. All 3 were unhurt, but held in place by the simple arithmetic of men with rifles at the fence. One of the armed men walked forward when Colton rode up. He had a certain comfortable authority about him, the kind that comes not from personal toughness, but from the knowledge that the person who signs his checks is tougher than anything he'll encounter. "Mr. Hayes," the man said. "You're on my land," Colton said. "About that." The man pulled a paper from his coat, folded, official-looking, the kind of document that exists specifically to make legal violence feel orderly. "Mr. Vance has initiated emergency proceedings regarding the outstanding loan balance on these properties. As of 6 this morning, his office has been granted temporary custodial authority pending final resolution." That paper isn't worth what it's printed on, and Vance knows it. "The judge in Rollins signed it at 5 this morning." "Which judge?" The man smiled in a way that answered the question without answering it. "The relevant one." Colton looked at his 3 ranch hands. Denny looked terrified and was trying very hard not to show it, which Colton respected. Paris had his jaw set and his fists at his sides. Webb was watching the armed men at the fence with the careful attention of someone counting and measuring. "My men go free," Colton said. "Your men are free to leave the property at any time," the man agreed pleasantly. "They just can't remain on Mr. Vance's—" "Don't!" Colton's voice didn't rise. It went the opposite direction, dropping to something quiet and flat that caused the man's pleasantness to flicker slightly. "Don't say that. Not on this land." A silence settled over the yard. The barn crackled and shifted, a section of roof giving way with a sound like a distant avalanche. "You have until sunset," the man said. "After that, Mr. Vance will be taking possession formally. He asks, and this is a direct quote, that you don't make it difficult." Colton looked at the burning barn one more time. Then he turned his horse and rode back down the road. Eli caught up with him 50 yards out, where the road curved behind a stand of cottonwoods and the ranch was briefly invisible. "What do we do?" "Get Paris and Webb and Denny. Get them out of there." "And then?" Colton thought about sunset, about the courthouse, about a woman he'd asked an impossible thing of and then failed to meet at the appointed hour. "Then we go to town," he said. Lydia had waited until 12:15. She told herself she was being practical. The man might have been delayed, roads were unreliable, ranching was unpredictable, and she stood outside the courthouse addition with her arms folded and watched the main street of Harlan Creek go about its late morning business with the composed expression she'd learned to maintain when a situation was uncertain. At 12:20, she accepted that he wasn't coming and began walking back toward the boarding house, and spent the walk analyzing her own emotional response to this development with the same thoroughness she'd have applied to a mathematical problem. She wasn't angry. She wasn't exactly relieved either. What she was, she concluded, was unsettled, which was different from either of those things. She'd made a decision over the course of the morning, sitting in her new classroom with its 4 rows of desks and its smell of chalk dust and old wood, and she'd arrived at it through the same process she arrived at most decisions. She'd looked at the information she had, assessed what she actually knew about the situation versus what she was assuming, and then listened to the quieter part of her mind that didn't use words. The quieter part had said, "You've been afraid before, and the times you acted afraid were never the ones you remembered well." She'd been going to say yes, and now he hadn't shown up, which meant something had happened, and she was walking back toward a boarding house while trying to decide what to do with a decision she'd made for a situation that might no longer exist. She was thinking through this with some focus when she nearly walked directly into Margaret Ellison, who was coming the other direction with a basket and an expression that suggested she had information. "There's trouble out at Hayes Ranch," Margaret said without preamble. "Word came in 20 minutes ago. Vance's men surrounded the place. Burned the north barn." Lydia stopped. "Is anyone hurt?" "Not yet, but Colton Hayes is riding back to town and there's a clock running." Margaret studied Lydia's face with the thorough attention of someone who'd been reading people for 60 years. "He asked you something this morning." It wasn't a question. Lydia didn't ask how she knew. "He did," Lydia said. "And?" "He didn't show up at noon." "Because his barn was burning." Margaret's voice was dry but not unkind. "What was your answer going to be?" Lydia looked down the street toward the north road. Dust was still visible in the distance, recent hoofbeats. "Yes," she said. Margaret nodded once, the way people nod when something confirms what they already suspected. "Then you'd better get to the courthouse before sunset." She shifted her basket. "And you'd better be sure because this town talks, and what you do today will follow you here for years." "I'm aware of that." "Are you sure?" Lydia thought about the pale-eyed outlaw's hand on her coat, about a man who'd dismounted at a dead gallop and shot twice before his horse stopped, about the way he'd crouched in the road to pick up her scattered books. "I'm sure," she said. She found him coming up the main street from the south end, riding hard, Eli at his side and 3 other men behind. He saw her at the same moment she saw him and pulled up, and for a moment they just looked at each other across 20 feet of Harlan Creek's unpaved main street. She said, "You're late." "I know." His voice was rough with something, not emotion exactly, but the effort of holding various things in check. "Lydia, I know about the barn," she said. "Margaret told me." She looked at him steadily. "My answer is yes, if you still need it to be." Something crossed his face that she couldn't entirely read and didn't try to. He dismounted, and up close she could see the dust on his coat and the set of his jaw and the exhaustion that comes not from physical effort but from the particular weight of watching something you can't stop happen. "You don't have to do this," he said, quietly enough that the men behind him couldn't hear. "You said that yesterday." "I mean it more today." "I know you do." She held his gaze. "That's part of why the answer is still yes." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "The courthouse closes for lunch until 1. We have 40 minutes. "Then we should stop talking," she said, and started walking. They were married at 1:17 in the afternoon by the county clerk, a man named Harold Briggs, who had been performing this function for 19 years and had developed a professional neutrality toward the emotional states of the participants. The widow from the stagecoach served as one witness, which surprised Lydia considerably. Margaret Ellison, who had apparently followed at a discreet distance, served as the other. The widow said afterward, "I've seen worse reasons," which Lydia suspected was her version of a blessing. The paperwork was filed at 1:32. Silas Vance received notice of it at 2:15. Lydia learned about his reaction secondhand through Eli, who had been near the telegraph office when Vance's clerk came out looking like he'd bitten into something rotten. Vance had apparently said a number of things that the telegraph operator refused to repeat in mixed company, and had then summoned his lawyer and spent an hour in a closed room. At 3:30, a different man arrived at the courthouse. Not the comfortable authority man from the ranch, but a thin, precise figure with a leather satchel who spoke to Harold Briggs for 15 minutes and then left with an expression of contained frustration. Briggs came to find Colton at the livery stable, where he'd gone to assess what equipment might need to be moved if Vance's men returned. "He's looking for irregularities in the filing," Briggs said. "The timing, the witnesses, whether the ceremony met minimum legal requirements." "Does it?" Colton said. "It meets every requirement exactly." Briggs allowed himself a small, precise satisfaction. "I've been doing this for 19 years. I don't make filing errors." Colton nodded. "Thank you, Harold." "Don't thank me. Just keep that ranch." Briggs adjusted his coat. "Your father was a decent man. This valley doesn't need what Vance is selling." He left, and Colton leaned against the stable wall and let out a slow breath. The barn was gone. The legal immediate threat was addressed, at least temporarily. But Vance wasn't done. Anyone who'd watched him operate for the past 3 years knew that a setback was just a change of approach. He'd come back at the loan from another angle, or he'd find something in the deed language, or he'd simply increase the pressure in ways that didn't require lawyers. He found Lydia at the boarding house at 4 o'clock. She was in the parlor, writing something in a small notebook, and she looked up when he came in with the particular expression of someone who's been thinking about a problem from multiple angles and hasn't finished yet. "He'll try something else," she said before he could speak. He stopped just inside the door. "Yes." "The loan is still outstanding." "Yes." "What are the terms exactly?" He told her. She wrote things in the notebook, occasionally asking a question, mostly listening with the careful attention he was beginning to recognize as characteristic. She asked about the original lender, about when the debt had been sold to Vance, about whether there was documentation of the sale, about the interest that had accrued versus the interest that had been claimed. "Why?" he said finally. She looked up. "Because land fraud requires documentation to sustain itself. Every forged step leaves a record somewhere. The question is whether the record is accessible." She tapped the notebook with her pen. "Do you have all the original paperwork? Every letter, every note, every payment receipt?" "Most of it. My father kept records." "I want to see it," she said. He considered her for a moment. "You don't have to involve yourself in—" "I married you 3 hours ago," she said simply. "I'm already involved." He couldn't argue with the logic of that. They spent the next 2 hours at the ranch house, spread across the kitchen table with 11 years of financial records between them, payment ledgers, correspondence, the original loan document, 4 years of demand letters from Vance's lawyers and his predecessor. Lydia read methodically. She had, Colton noticed, a way of going through documents that wasn't the skim reading of impatience, but the systematic movement of someone who knew what she was looking for even before she found it. His ranch hands had come back. Paris and Webb and Denny were working quietly outside, and there were 2 or 3 neighbors who'd ridden over when the smoke column was visible from their land. People who'd grown up alongside the Hayes family and showed up when there was trouble the way people did in places where showing up was the only currency that mattered. A woman named Clara Dutton, whose husband ran the neighboring spread to the east, appeared at the kitchen door around 5 o'clock with a pot of something hot and the brisk manner of someone who was angry on someone else's behalf and channeling it into practical action. "Vance burned that barn," she said, setting the pot on the stove. "Frank says there's no question about it. His men were seen on your north fence line 2 hours before the fire started." "I know," Colton said. "Frank's talking to the Reeder brothers and to Jesse Polk." Clara glanced at Lydia, who was still going through documents with single-minded focus. "Who's this?" "Lydia," Lydia said, without looking up. "Lydia Hayes." There was a brief pause. Clara looked at Colton. He kept his expression neutral, which Clara clearly found both informative and unsatisfying. She looked at Lydia again, at the documents spread across the table, at the notebook beside them. "Can you read contract law?" Clara said. "I'm familiar with the basics," Lydia said. "I'd want someone trained to verify anything significant. There's a lawyer in Rawlins, Morton. He handled our deed disputes 2 years ago. He doesn't like Vance. Does he have a reason?" "Vance tried to buy his office building out from under him." Clara poured 2 cups from the pot, coffee, thick and black. That tends to produce lasting professional opinions. Lydia looked up at Colton. We should contact him. Morton doesn't come cheap. No, she agreed. But what we lose if we don't contact him will cost considerably more. She held his gaze. The interest calculations in the 1891 correspondence don't match the rate stated in the original loan document. That's either a clerical error or it's intentional. Either way, it matters. Colton sat down across from her. Show me. She did. It took 20 minutes to walk through it, comparing 3 separate documents against each other. And by the end of it, Colton was leaning forward with his elbows on the table and a look on his face that Lydia recognized as the particular alertness of a man who'd been fighting blind, suddenly getting a clear sight line. He inflated the balance, Colton said. Possibly. Or the previous lender made errors that Vance then relied on when he purchased the debt. She kept her voice careful. We'd need Morton to confirm it. But yes, it looks like the outstanding amount claimed in every demand letter for the past 4 years may be significantly higher than what can be legally supported. From outside came the sound of more hooves, not the hurried sound of trouble, but the measured arrival of people coming with purpose. Colton went to the door. Frank Dutton was there, and the 2 Reeder brothers, and an older man named Jesse Polk, who'd been ranching the territory for 40 years and had seen 3 different land grabs attempted in the valley over that time, and had a low opinion of all of them. Behind them were 4 other men Colton recognized. Neighbors, ranchers, people who'd watched Vance acquire adjacent properties one by one over the past decade and had their own reasons for being here tonight. We heard about the barn, Frank said. We're not letting it go further, Jesse Polk added. His voice had the particular texture of a man stating a fact rather than making a speech. Colton looked at the assembled group. 9 men in the yard, people with their own families and their own debts, and their own reasons to be cautious, who had ridden out anyway. He stepped back from the doorway. Come inside, Chow, he said. There's coffee and there's something you all need to hear. What followed was less a meeting than a sorting out. People talked over each other, asked questions, went back over points they hadn't understood, disagreed about Vance's specific intentions, and agreed about his general character. Lydia sat at the kitchen table through it with her notebook, and only spoke when someone asked her a direct question. But when she spoke, the room went quieter in the way rooms go quiet, when the person talking is saying something precise in a situation that has been imprecise. She explained the discrepancy in the loan documents. She explained what it would mean legally if the balance had been deliberately inflated. She explained, carefully and without dramatizing it, that the kind of systematic documentation she'd seen in 11 years of Colton's records was the kind of thing a lawyer could build a serious challenge from. Jesse Polk, who had been a skeptic through the first 40 minutes of the gathering, said, How do you know any of this? My father was a surveyor, Lydia said. He spent 20 years in land disputes, and I spent 20 years watching him. I'm not a lawyer, but I know what the paperwork should look like when it's right, and I know what it looks like when it isn't. Jesse looked at Colton. Where'd she come from? Cheyenne, Colton said, by way of a stagecoach ambush. Jesse considered this. Then he said, All right, in the tone of a man who has decided a thing and won't be revisiting it. The gathering broke up around 8 o'clock, with commitments made and a plan of the roughest kind taking shape. Contact Morton and Rollins, pool resources for legal fees if necessary, watch the fence lines, and make it clear to anyone Vance sent that the people in this valley were no longer operating individually. That last part, Frank Dutton pointed out, was the thing that had allowed Vance to work for as long as he had. He'd gone after people one at a time, and one at a time they'd been manageable. A dozen families with connected interests were something else. He knows that, Colton said. Then he'll move faster, Jesse said. Probably. Let him. Jesse pulled his hat on. Faster means sloppier. Sloppier means mistakes. Mistakes means Morton can do something with them. He left, and the yard emptied out, and the night settled in over the ranch with the particular quietness of high-altitude dark. The kind where stars are visible in numbers that feel excessive, and the air has a cold edge regardless of the month. Colton stood in the yard after the last rider left and looked at the ruined north barn. The fire had burned itself out hours ago. What was left was a collection of charred uprights and collapsed roof beams, structural skeleton of something that had stood for 40 years. The smell of it was still in the air. That specific acrid sweetness of old wood burned long and slow. He heard the door behind him and didn't turn around. Lydia came to stand a few feet away. She looked at the barn for a moment without speaking. "It can be rebuilt," she said finally. "I know." He paused. "It's not the wood I'm thinking about." She looked at him sideways. "My father built that with 2 neighbors and 3 weeks of summer," he said. "One of those neighbors is buried on the East Ridge. The other moved away 15 years ago. My father's been gone 8 years. He stopped. "The barn is just a barn. But it's also everything I just told you, and when something like that burns down, it takes all of it with it." She was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said. "I know something about that." He believed her. They stood in the dark for a while without speaking, which was not uncomfortable. The horses were quiet in the remaining stable. Somewhere out on the north pasture, an owl was hunting. Eventually he said, "I didn't figure on any of this when I asked you." "No," she agreed. "I didn't figure on it either. You could still leave. Take the boarding house, start the school Monday, be entirely clear of this." She turned to look at him, and in the dark her expression was harder to read but not impossible. "I could," she said. "But I spent 2 hours in your kitchen looking at a decade of paperwork, and I found something in it that might actually matter. I'm not very good at walking away from things that might actually matter." He looked at her. "That's a peculiar reason to stay." "I'm a practical person," she said. "Peculiar reasons are often the most practical ones." Something crossed his expression. Not quite a smile, but adjacent. She had the sense, looking at him in the dark, that she was seeing something he didn't show often. "You should take my parents' room," he said. "It's the largest. I'll take the room off the kitchen." She nodded. "And tomorrow morning," he continued, "I want to ride the east fence line before we do anything else. If Vance's men are going to move again, that's the likely direction." "Wake me when you go," she said. He looked at her. "You don't need to." "I know I don't need to." She turned toward the house. "Wake me anyway." She went inside. He stayed in the yard for a few minutes longer, looking at the remains of the barn and the stars beyond it, and thought about what an improbable 24 hours it had been, and about the peculiar sensation of having expected to fight this alone, and finding quite suddenly that he wasn't. It wasn't comfort, exactly. Or it was comfort and something else at the same time. Something with more weight to it, something that felt less like relief and more like responsibility of a new kind. He went inside and bolted the door, and the ranch was quiet. Across town, in the largest office on the main street, Silas Vance sat at his desk with a glass he wasn't drinking from and a copy of the marriage certificate that his lawyer had obtained from the county records, and which he'd been looking at for the past hour with an expression of absolute cold calculation. He set it down. He said to the lawyer seated across from him, "Who is she?" "Lydia Rowan, arrived yesterday from Cheyenne, teaching position at the Harlan Creek School." "And Hayes knew her before yesterday?" "Apparently not." Vance was quiet for a moment. "A schoolteacher." He turned the certificate over, looked at the back, turned it front again. "Married the day she arrived." "It's legal," the lawyer said carefully. "The filing is clean. Briggs is meticulous." "I know Briggs is meticulous." Vance folded the certificate and put it in his jacket pocket. "Find out everything about her, where she came from, who her family was, whether she has any outstanding obligations, any history that complicates her standing." He stood. "And look at the loan documentation again. All of it, every number from the beginning." The lawyer, who was a careful man, heard something in that last instruction that he hadn't expected. "Is there something specific you're—" "Just look at it," Vance said. He picked up his glass, finally drank from it, and set it down with a quiet precision that was somehow more unsettling than any dramatic gesture. "I want to know before anyone else does whether there's anything in those numbers that doesn't hold." The lawyer left. Vance stood at his window and looked out at the dark street and the distant ridge where the Hayes land sat under the same stars it had sat under for 40 years. The marriage certificate was a problem. A schoolteacher who read contract documents was a different and more specific kind of problem. But Silas Vance had been building his operation in this valley for a decade through patience and methodical pressure, and he had not survived this long by responding to problems with anything as amateur as panic. He had people in Rollins. He had records that could be adjusted. He had a judge whose cooperation had already been established. And Hayes Ranch, with or without a convenient new wife, was still carrying a debt that Vance intended to collect on, one way or another. Outside, a dog barked once at something in the dark, then went quiet. The street was empty. The town slept. The clock on Vance's wall read 9:47. He had until the next legal hearing to find something he could use. He didn't intend to waste the time. The east fence line held nothing but morning. Colton rode it at first light with Lydia 2 lengths behind him on the roan mare he'd saddled without being asked, because she'd said, "Wake me anyway," and he had. And she'd been dressed and ready in 7 minutes, which was faster than Eli on most days. The fence was intact. No sign of recent riders. The grass held its shape the way grass only does when nothing heavy has moved through it overnight. And the only tracks at the property boundary were old ones, deer and rabbit, the ordinary evidence of a night that had passed without incident. He should have found that reassuring. He didn't. "He's thinking," Lydia said from behind him. Colton looked back. She was watching the fence line the same way he was, so, not anxiously, but with the particular attention of someone expecting the answer to present itself if you look long enough. "Vance," he said. It wasn't a question. "Last night was about pressure, showing you what he could do." She paused. But the marriage certificate changed his position. "He's recalculating." "He told you that?" "No. But men like him don't move twice in the same direction when the first move doesn't work. They go quiet, and then they come from somewhere else." She looked at him. "Did he ever try to buy the ranch directly? Before the legal approach?" Colton turned his horse and started back along the fence. 4 years ago. Sent a man with a number." "What number?" "Low enough to be an insult." "And when you said no?" "The demand letters started 6 months later." He watched the horizon as he talked. "At first I thought it was coincidence, loan enforcement, standard pressure. Then I started seeing the pattern, the same timing. Every time I turned down one of his approaches, something would escalate on the legal side within the season." "So he uses the law the way some men use a fist," she said. "Exactly like that." "Then the documentation is where we hit back." She pulled her coat closer against the morning cold. "Did you write to Morton last night?" "Eli rode to Rollins before sunup. Should have a response by afternoon." She nodded. "Good." They finished the fence line and rode back to the ranch in the early light, and for a stretch of maybe 10 minutes, neither of them spoke, and it wasn't uncomfortable. Colton noticed that the absence of discomfort in silence with someone he'd known for less than 48 hours. He filed it without examining it, the way you file things you don't have time to think about yet. Breakfast was a practical affair. Paris had coffee going and biscuits from the previous night that were edible if you weren't particular. Denny sat at the far end of the table looking tired and young, and Webb ate standing up, which was his habit. Lydia sat and ate without ceremony and listened while Colton and Paris talked through what needed doing on the ranch that day. The surviving livestock, the equipment that had been in the north barn, what could be salvaged from the wreckage. "I can go through the salvage this morning," Webb offered. "Take Denny," Colton said. "Don't do it alone." Webb glanced at him. "You expecting more trouble?" "I'm not expecting anything specific, but Vance burned a barn to make a point, and men who burn barns sometimes have a follow-up thought." Denny, who had been quiet through this exchange, said, "What if they come back while you're not here?" It was a genuine question, asked with the directness of someone young enough to still ask obvious things without embarrassment. Colton looked at him. "Same thing we do when any problem shows up," he said. "Don't panic, don't escalate, and send for me." He paused. "But don't let them pass the yard fence. That's where the line is." Denny nodded. Something in his face settled. The morning passed in the way ranch mornings pass under pressure, with the strange duality of necessary ordinary work proceeding alongside the awareness that something larger is in motion. Colton repaired a gate hinge that had been broken for 2 weeks and shouldn't have been, and found himself grateful for the straightforward stubbornness of metal and wood. You applied force in the right place, and the thing either held or it didn't. There was no strategy required, no reading of intentions. Lydia spent the morning in the ranch house kitchen with the paperwork from the previous night, reorganizing it in a way that initially made Colton feel mildly territorial about his own records, and then made him feel quietly embarrassed about feeling territorial, because she was clearly doing something more systematic than he'd managed. She had, by 11 o'clock, produced a handwritten summary covering 2 pages. Dates, amounts, the specific language of each demand letter compared against the original loan terms, and a column of numbers that demonstrated the discrepancy she'd identified the previous evening laid out clearly enough that a person without legal training could follow it. He stood in the kitchen doorway looking at it over her shoulder. "This is good work," he said. She looked up briefly. "It's what the information was already saying. I just made it legible. Morton will be able to do something with it. He'll be able to do a great deal with it if the originals are as clean as they look." She set down her pen. "The question is timing. Vance is going to move on the loan from a different direction before Morton can file anything. He has a friendly judge in Rollins. Judge Tarbell. Is there anyone who can counter that?" Colton leaned against the doorframe. "District Court in Cheyenne, but that's a longer road." "How long?" "Weeks, if we're lucky. Months, realistically." He looked at the papers. "Vance knows that. He'll try to get something enforced locally before we can get it to the district level. Then we need to slow him down locally." "How?" She was quiet for a moment. Who else in this valley has been affected by his loan practices? Not just approached, actually damaged. Properties taken, debts called in early, anything with documentation, he thought. The Halloran family, west of the ridge, lost their east pastures 2 years ago. Ed Halloran swears the balance Vance claimed was wrong, but couldn't prove it. He paused. The widow Prentice, north of town, sold her property at a loss after Vance put pressure on a loan she'd co-signed with her husband before he died. He paused again. There are probably others. If we can find 4 or 5 people with similar documentation, similar discrepancies, Morton can go to the district court with a pattern rather than a single complaint. A pattern is harder to dismiss. She looked up at him. A single rancher claiming errors in a land loan is one thing. 5 ranchers showing the same error applied the same way is something else entirely. Colton was quiet for a moment. "You've thought about this before," he said. "This kind of problem." "My father dealt with a version of it when I was 12, she said. "A man in our county who was doing something similar, smaller scale. It went on for years because people didn't talk to each other." She folded her hands on the table. The moment they compared records, it was over in 6 months. He looked at her. "What happened to the man?" "Prison." She said it without satisfaction, which somehow made it more final. 3 years, and then he came out and moved somewhere else, and presumably started again. That part I don't know. Before he could respond, they heard hooves on the road outside. Wow. More than one horse, coming at a pace that was neither casual nor panicked, which meant either news or a planned visit. It was both. Eli came into the yard with a man Colton recognized from previous years, a lean, weathered figure named Art Halloran, Ed Halloran's oldest son, who worked the West Ridge property his father had shrunk to half its size under Vance's pressure. Behind Art came 2 other riders Colton knew less well, but recognized as men from further out on the valley's western edge. "Morton sent word back," Eli said, dismounting. He held out a folded paper. "He's coming, day after tomorrow." Colton took the paper, read it. The lawyer's handwriting was small and precise. He'd reviewed the summary Eli had delivered and had 3 specific questions and a strong preliminary opinion that the matter warranted immediate examination. He would arrive Thursday morning. "All right," Colton said. He looked at Art Halloran. "What brings you out?" Art dismounted and came straight to the point in the manner of a man who's been thinking about something for a long time. "Heard about the barn. Heard about Vance's men on your fence line." He pulled his hat off. "Colton, I've got papers from my father's dispute with Vance. 2 years of them. I never knew what to do with them, but if you're building something, I want them in it." Colton glanced at Lydia, who had come to stand in the kitchen doorway. "Come inside," he said. The kitchen became, by early afternoon, a working room. Art Halloran's documents joined Colton's on the table, and the 2 riders from the western edge, brothers named Cal and Thomas Reeve, who'd been watching Vance acquire adjacent land for 4 years with the helpless frustration of people who could see a pattern but couldn't stop it, had their own correspondence, their own loan records, their own set of numbers that didn't quite add up. Lydia worked through it with the same methodical patience she'd brought to everything so far. She asked questions, made notes, occasionally pushed back on something when the documentation was ambiguous rather than accepting the interpretation that suited them. Art Halloran, who had come in with the energy of a man who'd waited 2 years to do something useful, watched her work with visible reassessment of whatever he'd expected a schoolteacher to be. "You always like this?" he said, after she caught an error in his own reading of a compound interest clause. She looked up. "Like what?" "Like you're going to pass or fail something at the end of this." "I'm trying to make sure Morton has the clearest picture possible when he arrives," she said. "If I miss something now, it costs us time we don't have." Art considered this. "Fair enough," he said, and pushed another set of papers toward her. By 3 in the afternoon, they had documentation from 4 separate properties showing the same pattern, loan balances claimed by Vance that exceeded what the original terms supported, pressure applied at intervals that correlated with Vance's expansion timeline, and in 2 cases, language in demand letters that appeared to reference provisions not present in the original loan documents. Colton stood at the end of the table looking at what they'd assembled. It was substantial. Not finished. Morton would need to verify everything, and there were gaps, but substantial. "He's going to know we're building this," he said. "He already suspects it," Lydia said. "The moment his lawyer came to the courthouse looking for irregularities in our filing, he knew I'd looked at the loan documents." She gathered a set of pages and aligned them. "He'll try to move before Morton can formalize anything." "How fast?" "If I were him, I'd file something with Tarbell by end of week. Create an enforcement order that forces a legal response before we're ready." She paused. "Is there anything you owe on the ranch property itself? Not the loan? Anything else? Tax arrears? Any outstanding municipal assessments?" "Nothing." "You're certain?" "I pay my taxes in person every March. Harold Briggs is the county recorder. Ask him." She nodded. "I will." It was not a statement of distrust. He understood that. She was closing gaps, the same way you check a fence for holes. Not because you expect them, but because an unchecked fence is a fence with unknown properties. The Reeve brothers left around 4, with an agreement to return Thursday when Morton arrived. Art Halloran stayed longer, helping Paris with some of the salvage work from the barn. Physical labor that Colton suspected Art needed as much as the ranch did. At 5:30, Clara Dutton appeared again, this time with her husband Frank, and without the pot of coffee, which meant she was here on business rather than provision. Frank Dutton was a large, quiet man whose opinions were infrequent and therefore reliable. He sat at the kitchen table and laid his hands flat on the surface and said, "Vance had a meeting this afternoon, at his office. I know 3 of the men who went in." "Who?" Colton said. Frank named them. 2 were town businessmen, the kind whose relationship with Vance was financial rather than personal. 1 was unexpected. Colton's jaw tightened slightly. "Pearson." "He's been in debt to Vance for 18 months, Frank said. "I figured you should know." Pearson was the man who ran the Harlan Creek telegraph office, which meant that any wire communication in or out of town, including whatever Eli had sent to Morton, including Morton's response, had passed through a man who was now financially obligated to Silas Vance. "He'd know Morton is coming," Leah said quietly. "Yes?" Colton said. The room went still for a moment. "Can Morton come another way?" Clara asked. "Rollins to Harlan Creek? There's one road," Colton said. "Then Vance can have people on that road," Frank said. It wasn't an accusation or a conclusion, just the logical extension of what they already knew. But it sat in the room with the weight of something that had become more serious than a legal dispute. Colton stood. He went to the window and looked at the yard, at the remaining structures of the ranch, at the long shadows the late sun threw across the ground. He'd spent 3 years telling himself this would resolve through normal channels, that the law, given time, would correct what was being done. He'd watched Vance acquire 3 neighboring properties in that time, each one through some variation of legal pressure that everyone understood but no one could stop. The man was not going to stop because Morton came with a briefcase. "I'll ride to meet Morton," Colton said, "before he reaches the main road. Tomorrow night, camp short of the Valley Junction and come in early Thursday without using the telegraph." "He won't know to expect that," Eli said. "I'll send word through a different channel." Colton turned. "Clara, does your cousin still ride mail to Rollins on Wednesdays?" "She does." "Can she carry a letter?" "If I ask her." It was the kind of workaround that shouldn't be necessary, hand-carrying a message through a private mail route to avoid a compromised telegraph office, like something from a previous era. But the previous era had understood something the current one sometimes forgot, that the formal systems only worked when the people running them were honest, and when they weren't, you went around. Colton wrote the letter at the kitchen table while the others waited. A short, precise note to Morton explaining the situation with Pearson and the alternative arrangement. Lydia read it over his shoulder without asking permission, which he had stopped noticing because it had already become ordinary. "Add this," she said, and told him 2 sentences to include about the documentation they'd assembled and what Morton should bring in terms of specific reference materials. He added them. Clara took the letter and left. Frank Dutton stayed another hour, and the conversation turned to the question of what Vance might do in the gap, the days between now and Morton's arrival, when he knew something was being built against him and the clock was running. Frank thought he'd apply financial pressure through the town's business relationships first, trying to isolate the people who'd committed to the effort. Art Halloran, who'd come back inside by then, thought he'd try something more direct. "He burned a barn," Art said. "That's not a man who only uses lawyers." "The men at the fence were hired hands," Colton said, "not his people directly." "Does that matter?" Colton was quiet for a moment. "It matters in court, not in the middle of a field at night." Art looked at him. "So what do we do about that?" "We don't leave people alone," Colton said. "Nobody rides property lines solo. Nobody stays at their place without someone else knowing where they are." He paused. "I know that's difficult. People have work to do." "We manage," Frank said. It was 2 words, but they meant something. Frank Dutton had a practical authority that came from years of doing what he said he'd do in a valley where that was the relevant currency. When he said "we manage," he was speaking for more than himself. The evening settled in. People left in 1s and 2s, and the ranch went quiet again, with the particular quiet of a place that has had more people in it than usual and feels the absence of them. Lydia organized the documents into 3 groups: what they had, what they still needed, and what was ambiguous, and labeled each stack with a note in her small, precise handwriting. She was doing this at the kitchen table when Colton came back inside from checking the yard, and she didn't look up. "You're thinking about the road to Rawlins," she said. "Vance knows Morton is coming." "Yes." "A man who burns barns to make a point doesn't necessarily stop at barns." She set down her pen. "No." She looked up at him. "Are you going to meet Morton yourself?" "I'm going to ride out tomorrow evening. Get ahead of him." He leaned against the counter. "I'd rather not leave the ranch unoccupied." She held his gaze. "I'll be here." "I wasn't asking, Ma. I know you weren't." She turned back to the papers. "But I will be." He looked at her for a moment. She had, he was beginning to understand, a way of making decisions that didn't announce themselves as decisions. They simply emerged as facts, stated calmly and already concluded. He'd met people who confused calmness with passivity, and he understood now that those were not the same quality at all. "Eli will stay," he said. "And Paris." "Good." "Webb and Denny can cover the north." "Also good." He sat down at the table, across from the stacks of papers and the careful labels. Outside, the night was coming in fast, the temperature dropping the way it did at elevation, the stars becoming visible one by one as the sky darkened. "My father used to say this valley would outlast every man who tried to own it," Colton said. He wasn't sure why he said it. It emerged the way things sometimes emerged in fatigue, without editing. Lydia didn't respond immediately. She was reading something, and she finished the paragraph before she looked up. "He sounds like a man who understood the difference between land and property." Colton looked at her. "What's the difference?" "Property is what you own on paper," she said. "Land is what you belong to." She set the paper down. "Vance has never understood that distinction, which is ultimately why he'll lose." She said it without drama, like it was obvious, like it was simply the conclusion the evidence pointed to if you followed it far enough. He wanted to believe her. He found, looking across the table at the organized stacks of documentation and the small handwritten labels and the 2 pages of careful summary notes, that he more than half did. "Get some sleep," she said, turning back to the papers. "You're riding tomorrow evening, and you look like you haven't slept in 2 days. I haven't slept well in 2 days. Then go." She didn't look up. "I'll finish here." He went. He lay in the room off the kitchen and listened to the quiet scratch of her pen through the wall and the distant sounds of the ranch settling into night. And he thought about the letter he'd written and the road to Rawlins and the particular quality of the problem they were in, complex and dangerous and not yet resolved, but no longer shapeless. It had a shape now. the shape Lydia had given it. He fell asleep faster than he expected, which was its own kind of information. Across town, Silas Vance received a visitor at 10 o'clock. The man from the telegraph office, hat in hand, with a message he'd held back from its intended routing and copied before forwarding the original. Vance read it twice. He set it on his desk. He said very quietly, to no one in particular, "Morton." Then he picked up his pen and began writing instructions of his own, and the clock on the wall counted off the minutes of a night that was running in two directions at once. Colton wrote out, "Wednesday evening, with the particular stillness of a man who has reduced a complicated situation to its next necessary step. He told Eli to keep the yard lamp burning and to send someone to Frank Dutton's place if anything moved on the fence lines before dawn. He told Paris to sleep light. He told Denny, who'd been asking with his eyes all day whether he was going to be trusted with something real, to take the North Watch from midnight to 4. Denny straightened up when he heard it. Tried not to show how much it meant. Failed slightly, which Colton found he didn't mind. He told Lydia he'd be back by mid-morning Thursday with Morton. She was standing in the yard when he mounted, the evening cold already settling into the air around her, and she had her arms folded not against the cold, but in the particular way she held herself when she was thinking about multiple things simultaneously. "Vance knows you're going," she said. "Probably." "Then he knows the ranch has less coverage tonight, which is why Frank Dutton is riding over at 9 and staying until I'm back." He looked down at her. "I'm not leaving you unprotected. I need you to know that." She looked up at him with an expression that was neither reassured nor offended. "I know. I just want you to know that I'm aware of the variables." "You're always aware of the variables." "Someone has to be." A brief pause. "Be careful on the Rollins Road." It wasn't a sentimental instruction. She said it the same way she said everything, directly, without ornamentation. But there was a weight underneath it that he noticed and didn't examine at length because he had a road to ride. He went. The Rollins Road ran 40 miles through terrain that offered no shortage of places for a man to wait, if waiting was his intention. Colton knew every curve of it, had ridden it in daylight and dark, in weather and without, for 20 years. He knew where the road narrowed between rock faces at the 17-mile mark, where it dropped into a shallow creek crossing at 22, where the ridge on the eastern side gave a man on horseback a sightline over a quarter-mile of road below. He rode without a lamp. The moon was 3/4 full and sufficient. At the 12-mile mark he found what he'd been watching for. 2 horses tied at the tree line on the north side of the road, ground-hitched rather than to a branch, which meant whoever rode them expected to mount fast. He passed without changing pace, which required some discipline, and moved another half-mile before cutting off the road and circling back through the tree line to come up behind the position. 2 men, as it turned out. Hired, not personally invested. He could tell by the way they were sitting, the particular boredom of people being paid to wait rather than wanting to be there. He watched them for 3 minutes from the darkness of the trees. Then he came out of the tree line from directly behind them. "Evening," he said. Both men startled badly. The faster one went for his gun, which Colton had anticipated, and the physical sequence that followed was brief and one-sided, and ended with both men disarmed and sitting in the dirt with the specific expression of people reassessing their career choices. "Who sent you?" he said. The faster one looked at his companion. His companion looked at the ground. "I know who sent you," Colton said. "I'm asking as a formality." He picked up both their weapons, unloaded them, and handed them back empty. "Tell your employer that blocking a road is a federal offense. Tell him I said so. And tell him that whatever he's planning for the next 3 days, he should reconsider it carefully." He rode on. He found Morton at the 28-mile mark, camped exactly where Colton's letter had suggested, a small fire in a rock hollow that was invisible from the road. The lawyer was a compact man in his 50s with a gray beard and the hands of someone who'd spent more years than he'd planned behind a desk, and he looked up from his camp coffee without particular alarm when Colton came through the trees, which suggested either courage or the calm of a man who'd been expecting this. "Hayes," Morton said. "Morton." Colton dismounted, tied his horse. "You got my letter?" Courier girl rode hard. I appreciated the alternative arrangement. He poured a second cup from the pot on the fire and held it out. "Your wife sent a summary with Eli that I've been reading for the past 2 days. She's meticulous." "She is. Where'd she come from, before Wyoming?" Cheyenne. Her father did survey work. Morton nodded slowly, the nod of someone filing information. The discrepancy she identified in the 1891 compound interest rate is not a clerical error, he said. I've been through the original terms. Vance applied a rate that wasn't in the document. He's been doing it consistently, across every loan account he's held in this county, for at least 6 years. Colton was quiet for a moment. How many accounts? That I can confirm tonight? 11. Morton picked up his coffee. Likely more, but 11 is enough. 11 is a pattern with a capital P, and a pattern like this in land finance has a specific legal name that makes judges in Cheyenne pay close attention. Tarbell won't be involved. No, this goes well over Tarbell's head. Morton set the cup down. I need one more thing from you. The original deed documents for Hayes Ranch, not copies. The originals your father held at the time of the initial loan. Are they at the house? Tin box, top shelf of the back bedroom closet. I need to see them Thursday morning before we do anything else. He looked at Colton across the fire. Because if what I think is in them is actually in them, Silas Vance is not just a corrupt businessman. He's been committing systematic land fraud for the better part of a decade. And the remedy isn't a judgment in your favor on one property. The remedy is considerably larger. Colton looked at the fire. How considerably? Every property he's acquired through these methods is potentially subject to reversal. Every family that lost land to him through inflated balances has a claim. Morton's voice was careful, the voice of a man who knew what it meant to offer hope that wasn't yet certain. I'm not promising outcomes, but the structure of what your wife found, and what the Halloran documents confirm, and what the Reeve brothers' correspondence confirms, that structure is exactly what you need for a district court intervention. They camped until 3, then rode slowly back through the pre-dawn dark, entering Harlan Creek from the south before the town woke properly. The ranch was intact. Frank Dutton was in the yard when they arrived, looking tired but alert, and he reported a quiet night with one set of riders who'd appeared on the east road around midnight and then withdrawn when they saw the yard light and the additional horses at the fence. They counted horses, Frank said. Decided it wasn't worth it. Good, Colton said. Lydia came out of the house when she heard them arrive. She looked at Morton with the direct assessment she applied to everything, and Morton looked back with something between surprise and approval. Mrs. Hayes, he said, the summary you sent was exceptional work. It was what the document said, she replied, which was her version of accepting a compliment. Come inside. I have them organized by date and by property. Morton glanced at Colton. She does that, Colton said. They worked through the morning. Morton at the kitchen table with the original deed documents and his own reference materials. Lydia across from him with the organized stacks in her notebook. Colton present but largely quiet, because the work happening didn't require him, and he understood when to stay out of something's way. Art Halloran arrived at 9 with his father's original documents. The Reeve brothers came at 10. Morton moved through the materials with the focused speed of someone who knows exactly what he's looking for because he's been looking at it for 30 years. He asked questions of Lydia, precise technical questions about the discrepancies she'd identified, and she answered them with the same precision, and twice she pointed out something in the documentation that Morton had passed over, and both times he stopped, looked at her, looked at the document, and said, yes, in the tone of a man who doesn't use that word casually. By 11 o'clock, Morton sat back in his chair and looked at the assembled group with an expression that was controlled but not entirely concealing something underneath. I'm going to file an emergency injunction with the district court in Cheyenne, he said. Today. I'll ride back this afternoon and wire it directly, not through Harlan Creek. He looked at Colton. The injunction will freeze all of Vance's property enforcement actions in this county pending a full audit of his lending practices. Once filed, Tarbell can't touch anything without district court review. The room was very quiet. Art Halloran said, How long until it's filed? If I ride hard and wire from Rollins, it can be before the court by this evening. Emergency status means a duty judge reviews it tonight or first thing tomorrow. Morton began organizing his papers with deliberate efficiency. The question is what Vance does between now and then. He has people who watch the roads. He'll know I was here. He already knows, Colton said. 2 of his men were on the Rollins Road last night. Morton looked up sharply. You encountered them? They won't be a problem. Morton studied him for a moment, deciding how much he wanted to know about that, and settled on the professional judgment that it wasn't his area. Then he knows his timeline just shortened. He'll try to file something with Tarbell today, get an enforcement order in place before I can get the injunction through. He stood. I need to leave within the hour. He left within 40 minutes, which was better than he'd promised. Colton stood in the yard and watched Morton's horse disappear down the south road and turned the arithmetic over in his mind. Morton writing to Rollins, wiring Cheyenne. Vance's people watching, reporting back. Vance filing with Tarbell, who would be compliant and fast. Two processes running simultaneously, one trying to outrun the other, and the outcome depending on which got there first. He'll go to Tarbell this afternoon, Lydia said. She was standing beside him, which he hadn't heard her come to do. I know. Is there anything we can do to slow that down? He thought for a moment. The sheriff. She looked at him. Tom Aldridge has been sheriff here for 12 years, Colton said. He's not Vance's man. He's never been Vance's man, but he's also never had a specific reason to move against him. If I can show him what Morton put together this morning... He stopped. He can walk into Tarbell's office and ask questions, Lydia finished. Not block anything, just make the process take longer. An hour, maybe 2. That might be enough. Then go, she said. He went. Sheriff Tom Aldridge was a large, slow-moving man who compensated for the impression that slowness created by being considerably sharper than people expected. He listened to Colton in his office for 20 minutes without speaking, then looked at the 2 pages of Morton's preliminary notes that Colton had brought, then leaned back in his chair until it made a sound of structural complaint. How solid is Morton's injunction, he said. He said the pattern across 11 accounts is clear. How solid is the documentation it's based on? Colton hesitated only a moment. Solid enough that he called it exceptional. Aldridge looked at the ceiling. Vance has a filing ready for Tarbell. I happen to know this because Tarbell's clerk is my wife's nephew and is not gifted with discretion. He brought his gaze back down. If I walk over to Tarbell's office and ask to review a pending filing, which I have standing to do under county procedure, it takes Tarbell 45 minutes to locate the relevant protocol book, because Tarbell hates being questioned on procedure and makes a performance of finding the rule that allows it. 45 minutes, Colton said. Minimum. Aldridge stood. I'm not doing this for you personally, Hayes. I'm doing it because I've watched that man take 4 properties in this valley in 5 years and not been able to do a thing about it. And if Morton actually has what you're saying he has, I want it on record that this office cooperated. Understood. Go back to your ranch. Don't do anything I'll need to write a report about. Colton went back to his ranch. The afternoon moved with the terrible slowness of time when something important is happening somewhere else. Frank Dutton's wife Clara came by at 2 with no coffee this time, but with the information that Vance had been seen entering Tarbell's building at 1:30. Eli watched the road. Paris fixed the salvageable timber from the north barn wreckage. Denny, who had stayed up half the night on watch and should have been sleeping, was instead teaching himself to splice rope from a frayed coil he'd found in the equipment shed, which Colton observed without comment because it was better than watching the road. Lydia was in the house, writing. He found her at the kitchen table with 3 sheets of paper covered in her small handwriting, which turned out to be a formal accounting of the loan discrepancies organized by property, by date, and by amount. The kind of document that was not a legal brief but could sit behind one and make the lawyer's work immediately comprehensible to a judge seeing it for the first time. Morton didn't ask for this, Colton said. He didn't need to ask. She kept writing. A judge seeing this material for the first time will spend an hour understanding what took us 3 days to assemble. This reduces that hour to 10 minutes. She glanced up briefly. 10 minutes matters when you're talking about an emergency injunction. He sat down across from her. Lydia. She looked up fully. When this is done, he said, and then stopped because he hadn't thought through what came after when this is done, only that there was something that needed to be said that he didn't have the right words for. She waited. She was good at waiting without filling the silence. I don't know what you want, he said finally. After. You came here for a teaching position. You didn't come here for any of this. She set her pen down. No, she agreed. I didn't. The school is still there. The position is still yours. Whatever happens with the ranch, whatever... He stopped again. This was not a kind of conversation he had practiced with. I'm not going to hold you to something that started as a legal maneuver. It's not right. She looked at him for a long moment, not with the weighing expression of someone making a decision, but with something quieter than that, more settled. You keep telling me I can leave, she said, because it's true. Colton. She said his name with a directness that made it feel different from how other people said it. I'm sitting in your kitchen building a case file for a lawyer I met 6 hours ago, trying to save land that isn't legally mine, in a marriage that started as paperwork. She paused. I'm aware of what I'm doing, and I'm doing it anyway. At some point, you have to stop telling me I can leave and accept that I'm choosing to be here. He was quiet. That said, she continued, picking up her pen again, when this is over, we should have an actual conversation about what we are. But not now. Right now, the injunction is what matters. Right, he said. Are you going to sit there or do something useful? He almost smiled. I'll check the fence line. That's useful, she said, and went back to writing. He was at the east fence when Eli came riding from the direction of town at a pace that meant news, and Colton was already turning his horse before Eli reached him. Wire from Morton, Eli said, pulling up. He held out a folded paper, not from the Harlan Creek Telegraph, Colton noticed, but handwritten, which meant it had come through a private messenger. He got it through. Injunction was accepted by the duty judge in Cheyenne at 4:15, filed and official. Colton took the paper, read it again. Tarbell's filing, he said. Aldridge got there before Tarbell could process it. By the time Tarbell finished his procedure review, Morton's injunction was already in the system. Tarbell's clerk told the judge's office in Rawlins about Vance's filing, and they referred it to Cheyenne for review pending the injunction. Eli caught his breath. Vance can't move on any property enforcement in this county until the district court completes its audit. The word audit sat in the air between them. How long is the audit? Colton said. Morton says minimum 8 weeks, possibly 6 months. Eli looked at him. And Hayes? Morton says the scope. They're not just looking at Hayes Ranch. They're looking at every loan Vance has held in this county. Every property transaction. All of it. Colton folded the paper. He looked at the fence line, at the land beyond it, at the ridge line where the light was going amber in the late afternoon. 8 weeks minimum. 6 months possibly. And every property Vance had acquired potentially subject to review. The Halloran East pastures, the Widow Prentice's land, every family that had watched something taken from them and not been able to stop it. He rode back to the house. Lydia was still at the kitchen table when he came in. She looked at his face, not the paper, and knew before he said anything. It went through, she said. Filed at 4:15. He set Morton's note on the table. Audit of all Vance's county holdings. 8 weeks minimum. She looked at the note for a moment. Then she exhaled. Not dramatically, not a performance of relief, just the quiet release of breath that a person makes when something they've been holding against the possibility of failure is no longer necessary to hold. The Halloran family, she said. Yes. The Widow Prentice. And others. He pulled out a chair and sat down. Morton's going to need more documentation from each of them. The audit team will contact them directly, but it'll help if they have everything organized in advance. She nodded slowly. I can help with that. He looked at her across the table, at the 3 pages of careful handwriting in front of her, at the organized stacks from 4 days of work, at the pen still in her hand. Lydia, he said. Thank you. She looked up. He wasn't saying it the way he'd said it to Harold Briggs or to Morton or to Frank Dutton, with the professional gratitude of someone acknowledging useful help. He was saying it from somewhere more specific, and she seemed to understand that because she didn't deflect it or minimize it. You're welcome, she said quietly. Outside, the light was going. The remaining structures of the ranch stood against the early evening sky. The north barn was still a ruin, would need months to rebuild, and the work ahead was enormous and not finished, and there were loose threads and open questions, and Vance would be furious and dangerous in his fury. But the audit was filed. The land was not going anywhere. Eli put his head in the doorway. Paris wants to know if we're celebrating or working. Colton looked at Lydia. Both, she said before he could answer. Eli grinned, the first unguarded expression Colton had seen on any of his ranch hands in 4 days, and disappeared. Colton reached across the table and moved the ink pot so it wouldn't tip, because the table was uneven and the pot was near the edge. And that was the kind of thing nobody noticed until it was too late. It was a small, practical gesture in the middle of a large and complicated day, and Lydia noticed it and looked at his hand for a half-second longer than the gesture required. She didn't say anything. She went back to her notes. But something had shifted in the room, in the quality of the air between them, in the particular way two people sit at the same table when they are no longer strangers, pretending not to notice that they aren't. Across town, Silas Vance read the injunction notice in the same stillness with which he did everything. No visible anger, no dramatic response. His lawyer sat across the desk and waited. Vance folded the paper, set it down, looked at the window. "The woman," he said finally. "She assembled the documentation that Morton built the filing on," the lawyer confirmed. "A schoolteacher," Vance said, and there was something in his voice that was not admiration and not contempt, but something colder than either. He was quiet for a long time. 8 weeks, he said. Minimum. Find out everything about the audit team, who's leading it, who they'll contact first. He stood. And find out more about Lydia Hayes, where she actually came from, who her father was, what she actually knows. He walked to the window. Because no school teacher figures out a compound interest discrepancy in a stack of 11-year-old loan documents in one evening, unless someone taught her exactly what to look for. The lawyer made a note. Outside Vance's window, the main street of Harlan Creek was quiet, the town settling into its evening routines as if nothing had changed. But something had changed, and the people who lived here could feel it the way you feel a shift in weather before the sky shows it, in the quality of the air, in some adjustment of pressure too subtle to name. Something had given way. Not everything. Not yet. But something. The celebration that evening was modest by any measure. Paris found a bottle that had been sitting in the back of a kitchen cabinet since some occasion no one could precisely remember, and there was enough left in it for 5 small pours, which was exactly the right amount for 5 people who needed to mark something without losing their heads about it. Eli held his glass up without a speech, because Eli was not a speech-making man, and that was sufficient. Denny drank his with the slightly overwhelmed expression of someone participating in something larger than himself for the first time and knowing it. Webb, who had been stoic through the whole 4 days with the professionalism of a man who'd worked hard places before, allowed himself one long exhale and something that was almost a smile. Colton drank his and looked around the kitchen, at the table still covered in organized documents, at the marks on the wall where his mother had tracked her children's heights 30 years ago, at the window where the last light was dying over the ridge, and felt the complicated mixture of relief and exhaustion and something else he didn't have an immediate name for. Lydia drank hers and asked Eli a question about the salvage timeline for the North Barn, which was so characteristic of her that Eli laughed before he could answer, and the laugh was the best thing that had happened in the room in 4 days. But celebration had limits when the work wasn't finished, and everyone in the room understood that. The injunction was filed, the audit was coming. But Silas Vance was still across town with his money and his lawyers and the particular cold intelligence of a man who had not yet accepted that he'd lost. That understanding was what kept Colton from sleeping past 4 the next morning. He lay in the room off the kitchen, listening to the ranch breathe around him, the creak of old wood settling, the distant sound of horses moving in the stable, the wind off the ridge that came through every autumn and found every gap in every wall, and thought about Vance's last words through the lawyer, as relayed through Aldridge, who had taken it upon himself to be informally useful in ways the sheriff's office didn't officially sanction. Find out more about Lydia Hayes. He'd told her that. The previous night, after the others had gone and they were the last 2 at the kitchen table, he'd said it the way he said difficult things, directly and without preamble, and watched her face go through something careful. "He thinks someone trained me specifically," she'd said. "Did someone?" She was quiet for a moment. "My father spent the last 5 years of his working life trying to document what was being done to landowners in our county by a man named Grayson. He never finished it. He died before he had enough to take to court." She looked at the table. "I spent the 2 years after his death going through his papers, organizing them, trying to understand what he'd found." She paused. "He never got justice for those people. I put his work in a box and moved to Wyoming." "And Grayson?" Colton said. "Still operating, different county by now, probably." Her voice was level, but underneath it something old and unresolved moved. "That's what men like that do. They move. They find new territory. New people who don't know them yet. Colton had looked at her for a long moment. Like Vance. Vance is local, she said. He built his operation here over a decade. That's different from Grayson. But the mechanism is the same. She finally looked up. Which is why the audit has to be thorough. Not just Hayes Ranch, not just the Hallorans, all of it. She'd gone to bed after that, and he'd stayed at the table for another hour thinking about a woman who'd been carrying her father's unfinished work in a box for 2 years and had arrived in Wyoming with a teaching certificate and $43, and apparently the working knowledge of land finance fraud that the situation had turned out to require. Coincidence was a word for things you couldn't explain any other way. He wasn't sure coincidence was adequate here. The audit team arrived from Cheyenne 11 days later, 3 men from the district court's financial review office, led by a methodical examiner named Greer, who wore a suit that had been pressed before the journey and was not pressed by the end of it. They set up in the county records office, which Harold Briggs managed with the possessive efficiency of a man whose domain had been invaded, but who understood that this particular invasion was necessary. Morton came back from Rollins and stayed. What followed was 3 weeks of a particular kind of slow tension. Not the acute danger of the first days, but something sustained and grinding, the tension of a process that moved by inches while the thing being examined tried to find a way around it. Vance's lawyers filed 3 separate motions challenging the injunction's scope. All 3 were denied. They challenged the audit team's authority over certain property records. That was denied too. They found a technical objection to 2 of the Reeve brothers' original documents that briefly threatened to remove that property from the scope. Lydia caught it. She'd been working alongside Morton for 2 weeks by then, not as a lawyer, which she wasn't, but as the person who had organized the foundational documentation and could find any specific record in under 3 minutes, because she knew where everything was and why. When Vance's lawyers filed the technical objection, she read the filing within the hour and found the counter-reference in Art Halloran's documents within 20 minutes, a 1889 land grant registration that predated the objection's claimed starting point and undermined its entire premise. Morton took it to the audit team the same afternoon. The objection was dismissed the following morning. Vance's lead lawyer, a man named Covington, who'd come up from Denver when the scope of the audit became clear, looked at Lydia across a county records room table on a Tuesday afternoon and said, with the professional neutrality of a man who disliked what he was seeing but respected it, "You've done this before." "No," she said, "but my father did." Covington looked at his papers, said nothing further. Colton was present for this exchange, seated 2 chairs down with no particular expression, and he thought about the box she'd carried from whatever house she'd packed up in Cheyenne, the box with her father's unfinished work in it, and what it meant to have spent 2 years organizing someone else's failed attempt at justice and then arrived, 6 weeks later, at a situation where that preparation turned out to be the specific thing required. He didn't believe in the kind of fate that arranges things neatly. He'd seen too much of how the world actually worked to believe the universe was tidy. But he believed in preparation meeting circumstances. He believed in people carrying things forward that deserved to be carried. And he thought that Lydia Rowan, Lydia Hayes, on paper, though they still hadn't had the conversation she'd said they needed to have, had been carrying her father's work forward without knowing exactly where she was carrying it to, and had arrived somewhere. He thought her father would have recognized that. He didn't say any of this to her because the timing was wrong and the county records room was not the place, but he thought it. The audit's findings were released on a Thursday morning, 43 days after Morton had filed the injunction. Colton read the summary at the kitchen table with Lydia across from him and Morton standing at the window because he'd been sitting for 3 weeks and needed to stand. The document was 47 pages. Colton read the first 10 and the last 5, which was where the conclusions lived, and then he set it down. 19 properties. Over 11 years. A systematic inflation of loan balances averaging 23% above the legally contracted rates, applied consistently across every account Vance had acquired. The mechanism was the same in every case. A modification of the compound interest terms introduced after the original loan document was signed, buried in correspondence rather than in the primary contract, designed to be confusing enough that the borrower couldn't easily identify it, and small enough in any given year that it didn't trigger alarm. Over 11 years and 19 properties, It had accumulated into an enormous amount of money extracted from families who'd already been paying what they owed. The Halloran East pastures, Morton said. Eligible for reversal, Colton said, reading. Subject to court order. The Widow Prentice. Full compensation for the sale proceeds plus interest. He looked up. Morton. Yes. This is... He stopped. I know, Morton said. Lydia was reading her own copy of the summary, working through it with systematic attention, making small marks in the margin. She looked up and found both men watching her. The reversal mechanisms are going to take time, she said. Some of these properties have changed hands again since Vance acquired them. That complicates the chain of title. She set the document down. And Vance will appeal. He will, Morton confirmed. Probably twice. But the findings are clean. Greer's team was thorough. The appeals will fail. Eventually, she said. Eventually, he agreed. She looked at Colton. It's not over. I know. The Hallorans won't get their land back for another year, minimum, possibly 2. The Widow Prentice might not see compensation for 18 months. I know, he said again. She was watching him with some care. Are you all right with that? He thought about it, not as a rhetorical question, but as a real one. No, he said honestly. I'd rather it was immediate. I'd rather the people who lost things had them back tomorrow. He looked at the document on the table. But they'll have them back. That's different from where we were 6 weeks ago. She nodded. That seemed to be what she wanted to know. Morton left that afternoon with a briefcase full of filings and a handshake that lasted longer than was strictly professional because it was doing the work that words weren't quite adequate for. He paused at the door and looked at both of them. You should know, he said to Lydia, that when this case is cited, and it will be cited for the documentation methodology as much as the legal findings. What you built here was the foundation everything else stood on. She looked at him steadily. My father built the foundation. I just carried it here. Morton considered that for a moment. Then he nodded once and left. The silence after he was gone had a different quality than the silences of the past 6 weeks. Those had been working silences, full of things in motion. This one was the silence of something completed. Colton stood in the kitchen and looked at the empty table. The documents all filed away now, the stacks and labels and organized chaos of 6 weeks reduced to a clean wooden surface. The school, he said. Lydia, who was washing cups at the basin, turned to look at him. You haven't started, he said. You were supposed to start the Monday after you arrived. That was 6 weeks ago. The school board sent a note. They've been flexible, given the circumstances. She turned back to the basin. I'm starting Monday. Good. He paused. That's good. She finished with the cups and dried her hands and turned around. She leaned against the basin with her arms folded and looked at him with the expression he'd come to recognize as her thinking face. Not closed, not guarded, just processing. You said we needed to have a conversation, he said. I said that, yes. About what we are. That's what I said. He pulled out a chair and sat down, because this was not a conversation to have standing in a kitchen doorway. She stayed where she was. I don't know how to do this, he said. I want to be clear about that from the start. I've spent 14 years running this ranch, and the last 3 of those fighting for it, and somewhere in there I stopped making room for anything that wasn't the work. I know, she said. It's not about not wanting, it's about not knowing how to want something without immediately calculating whether I can afford to lose it. She was quiet for a moment. That's a very honest thing to say. It's how it is. He looked at the table. And you came here for a teaching position. That's what you came for. You didn't come here to be married to a man who isn't. He stopped, started again. You shouldn't have to build your life around someone else's incomplete one. She walked from the basin to the table and sat down across from him, which was how they'd sat through the whole 6 weeks, and somehow that geography made the conversation feel navigable. My father used to say that the hardest kind of courage is the kind that doesn't look like anything, she said. Not the kind that draws a gun or rides toward a fire. The kind that shows up every day for something that isn't certain yet. He looked at her. You've been showing up every day for this ranch for 14 years with no guarantee it would ever be secure, she said. That's not a man who doesn't know how to commit to something. That's a man who doesn't know he already does. He was quiet for a long moment. "You're going to teach school Monday," he said. "Yes. And come back here after." She looked at him. "If that's what we decide." "I'm deciding it," he said. "If you are." She held his gaze for what felt like a long time, but was probably 15 seconds. "Then I am," she said. It was not a romantic declaration. It didn't have violins in it or perfect lighting. It had a kitchen table and two people who were tired and had been through something difficult and were being careful with each other in the particular way of people who have both lost things before and know what loss feels like. But it was real. And real, Colton had come to understand at some point in the past 6 weeks that he couldn't precisely locate was worth more than perfect. 3 days later, Silas Vance left Harlan Creek. He didn't make an announcement. He didn't say goodbye to anyone or hold a meeting or attempt any final maneuver. He simply was there one evening and gone by morning, and the news moved through town the way news moves in small places, faster than it should, reaching everyone before the day was fully started, carrying with it the particular quality of information that people had been waiting for without knowing they were waiting. His office sat locked for a week before his lawyers came to settle accounts. The properties under dispute were formally frozen pending the court's resolution process. Tarbell, who had been aggressively quiet since the injunction, submitted a voluntary recusal from all Vance-related proceedings that his colleagues in the legal community read as the action of a man deciding in advance what could and couldn't be proven about him. Art Halloran rode out to the east pastures the morning after Vance left and stood at the fence line of land he hadn't been able to stand at for 2 years, and was reported by his wife to have been out there for a long time without doing anything in particular. Some things don't need explanation. The widow Prentice came to the ranch on a Saturday to thank Colton in person, which he found awkward in the way he found most direct expressions of gratitude awkward, and she was perceptive enough to address herself largely to Lydia instead, which made the visit easier for everyone. She stayed for an hour, drank coffee, and at the door said to Lydia, "Your father would be proud," which was something she couldn't have known, but turned out to be exactly the right thing to say. Lydia held herself together until the woman's buggy was out of sight. Then she sat down on the porch steps and pressed her hands against her knees and breathed carefully for a while. Colton sat down beside her, not touching, not speaking, just present, in the straightforward physical way that presence sometimes substitutes for everything language can't do. After a few minutes, she said, "I never thought I'd get to finish it." "His work?" "Yes." She looked out at the yard. "I didn't come here with that plan. I came here because there was a teaching position, and I needed a fresh start, and Wyoming seemed far enough from everything to feel like a different life." She paused. "I didn't know Vance was operating here until I arrived. I didn't know any of this was waiting." "But you recognized it when you saw it." "Yes." "Because you'd seen it before." "Yes." She was quiet. "My father spent years building something that didn't save anyone. I spent 2 years after he died thinking that's just how these things go, that the people with money and lawyers and judges in their pockets always outlast the people with documentation and determination." She looked at the ridgeline. "I was wrong about that. Or at least, I was wrong about how inevitable it is." Colton looked at the same ridge. "I wasn't wrong. He just ran out of time." She turned to look at him. "The work he did," Colton said. "You brought it here. You used it here. That's not a failure. I don't know what to call it, but it's not a failure." She looked at him for a long moment. "No," she said finally. "It's not." The North Barn took 3 months to rebuild. The community built it, not as a gesture, not as a performance of solidarity, but in the practical way of people who understood that a working ranch needs its structures, and that shared labor is faster than individual labor, and that the work itself is its own form of conversation. Frank and Clara Dutton came, the Reeve brothers, Art Halloran and his father, Ed, who moved more slowly now, but who shaped timber with the knowledge of 40 years and wouldn't hear of staying home. Jesse Polk showed up on the first Saturday with 3 of his hands and a wagon of good pine lumber from his own stores. And when Colton tried to settle accounts, Jesse looked at him, the way old men look at young ones who have missed an obvious point. "You don't settle accounts on something like this," Jesse said. Colton let it go. Lydia taught school Monday through Friday and came home to the ranch each evening. She was a good teacher. This was not a surprise to Colton, who had seen how she explained things to Morton, to Art Halloran, to the audit team, always finding the angle that made the complex thing visible without flattening it into something false. The children liked her, which she reported with the understated pleasure of someone who'd hoped for it but hadn't assumed it. She also kept helping the families working through the court's reversal process, unpaid, without anyone asking her to, simply because she had the knowledge and they needed it. And asking for payment for that particular application of that particular knowledge felt wrong to her in a way she couldn't have articulated precisely, but didn't need to. She and Colton had an argument in October about how much wood to order for winter, which was their first real argument. And it was not about the wood at all, but about the fact that he'd made a decision about the ranch's resources without consulting her, which she found exclusionary, and he found bewildering because he'd been making those decisions alone for 14 years, and the habit of it was deep. He was wrong about it, and he knew it about halfway through the argument and said so, which surprised her. And then they worked out a system for ranch decisions that was more functional than whatever they'd been doing, which was more or less nothing. Marriage, both of them were discovering, was less like the formal thing it was on paper, and more like a language you learned by speaking it, badly at first, with the particular embarrassment of adults who are accustomed to competence, and then incrementally better as the vocabulary built up. They were both practical people. Practical people learn languages. The evening Colton found the box was a Wednesday in November, during the repairs to the ranch house's interior, fixing floor planks that had been warped by years of temperature cycling and a leak in the roof that predated his father's death. He pulled up a section of loose board near the back bedroom wall and found a tin box beneath it, wedged into the floor structure in a way that was clearly intentional. He sat back on his heels and looked at it for a moment before calling for Lydia. She came in from the kitchen, wiping her hands, looked at the box, looked at him. "Is it old?" "The tin is my father's," he said. "I recognize it." He opened it. Inside, 7 letters, tied with a cord, the paper aged to the color of old tea. The handwriting on the envelopes was his father's, formal and deliberate in the way his father did everything, addressed to his mother, postmarked from the years before they were married. He didn't read them there. He sat with the box in his lap for a while, and Lydia sat beside him on the floor amid the pulled-up floorboards and didn't rush anything. Eventually he untied the cord and opened the letter on top, which was dated from the spring his father was 29, and read it. It was the letter of a man who was not accustomed to speaking about the things that mattered to him, written to a woman he was still working up the specific courage to fully reach toward. And it had all the clumsiness of something composed by someone who knew words were inadequate and wrote them anyway. Near the bottom was a sentence his father had apparently needed to say, even though he wasn't sure how. The strongest love rarely begins with perfect timing. Sometimes it arrives wearing the clothes of trouble, and you only recognize it afterward, when the trouble is over and the thing itself is still standing there. Colton read it twice. Then he handed it to Lydia without saying anything, because there wasn't anything to say that the letter hadn't already said better. She read it. He watched her face while she did, the careful attention she brought to everything, and then something shifting underneath that care. Something that was not performance or response to expectation, but simply the effect of one true thing meeting another. She folded the letter along its original creases and held it for a moment before handing it back. "He knew," she said. "He knew a lot of things he didn't say out loud." Colton put the letter back with the others. "That was his way. It's yours too sometimes." He looked at her. "Not a criticism," she said. "Just accurate." He thought about the months since August. About a practical woman who'd made a practical decision in a harness shop alley and had never made him feel like the decision was something she regretted or was waiting out. About arguments over firewood and the way she stacked documents and the sound of her pen through the wall at night while he was trying to sleep. About the fact that he'd stopped calculating, somewhere between September and October, whether he could afford to lose this. He'd stopped calculating because the calculation had become irrelevant. That was its own kind of answer. "I need to tell you something," he said. She waited. "I don't know how to say this without it sounding—" He stopped. Tried again. "The day I asked you, in the alley behind the harness shop, I told myself it was practical, that it had to be practical because there wasn't time for anything else, and because I didn't have the right to ask you for more than a practical thing." "I know," she said. That was true. At the time. She was very still. It's not the whole truth anymore, he said. The November light was going, the early dark of late autumn coming through the windows, and they were sitting on a floor with pulled-up boards around them and a tin box between them, which was not the setting anyone would have planned for what was happening. But then nothing about any of this had been planned, and Colton was beginning to think that was the point. He reached across the space between them and tucked a strand of hair that had come loose back behind her ear, which was a thing he'd been not doing for weeks because it hadn't been his right yet to do it. And she went very still for a different reason. He left his hand there, at the side of her face, and she turned into it slightly, just slightly, the smallest possible motion, but present. Then she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his cheek, soft and brief and certain, and pulled back. They sat with that between them for a moment. "Your father was right," she said quietly. "About what?" "The trouble is over." She looked at him. "And the thing itself is still standing there." He looked at her for a long moment in the failing light. Then he kissed her, not her cheek, her mouth. And it was the kind of kiss that doesn't try to be anything other than what it is, which was everything it needed to be. Outside the ranch house windows, the land ran out in every direction under the November sky. South pasture, east fence line, the ridge that turned colors with the season, the field where the north barn was rising again from its foundation, pine pale and strong and not finished yet but standing. His grandfather's land, his father's land, his, and hers, now, on paper and otherwise. People would tell the story later, the way small communities hold on to their stories and turn them in the light to see different things at different times. They'd say it was about a marriage of convenience, or about a land dispute, or about a woman who happened to know the right things at the right time. They'd get most of it right and some of it wrong, which was the nature of stories that pass between people. What they'd almost always miss was the part that mattered most, the particular courage of two people who'd both been worn down by life in different ways, who'd both learned to keep things at a distance because distance is safer, who'd arrived at the same kitchen table from opposite directions and had to learn, slowly and imperfectly, and with arguments about firewood, how to stop calculating the odds and just be present in the same place at the same time. That's not a dramatic story. It doesn't have a clean moment where the music swells and everything becomes clear. It's the accumulated weight of small choices made daily, the decision each morning to show up for something that isn't certain yet. Lydia's father had understood something like this and died before he could finish it. She'd carried his work forward without a destination, and the destination had found her anyway. Colton had spent 14 years holding the land and losing everything else, and then spent 6 weeks watching a woman he'd asked a desperate and impractical thing of become the most practical and essential person in his life. Neither of them had arrived in August planning any of it. But then, and this was the thing that turned over in Lydia's mind years later, when she was old enough to think about her life with some distance, the best things rarely arrive on schedule. They arrive when they arrive in the form they take, wearing whatever they're wearing, and the only question that matters is whether you're paying enough attention to recognize them. She had been paying attention, so had he. That turned out to be enough.